It was one of those evenings that felt perfect in every way, the kind of evening people talk about years later, remembering how everything seemed to glow with happiness. The lights at the Hale family mansion were warm and golden. Laughter echoed across the lawn and music played softly under the stars. That was the night Grace got engaged to Daniel. Grace was the kind of woman who drew attention wherever she went. She was confident, beautiful, and full of life. Her younger sister, Emily, was the quiet one, the one who always stayed in the background, helping with little things, smiling politely when no one noticed. The two sisters were close growing up, but over the years, Grace's big personality and ambitions often took center stage, while Emily's kindness and patience quietly supported the family from behind. When Daniel came into their lives, everything changed. He was young, successful, and came from a wealthy family that owned one of the biggest construction companies in the city. He was known for his calm, respectful manner and how deeply he loved Grace. From the moment he proposed, the entire family celebrated as if they had won the lottery. Grace's parents were overjoyed. Her father kept saying how proud he was to see his daughter marry such a fine man, while her mother couldn't stop talking about wedding dresses, venues, and guest lists. Emily watched it all with genuine happiness for her sister, even though sometimes she felt a little invisible among all the excitement. Grace, on the other hand, was living her dream. She would tell Emily stories about how she and Daniel were going to travel the world, buy a new home near the coast, and eventually start a charity foundation together. Emily listened, smiling, and felt happy just seeing her sister's joy. Daniel treated Emily kindly too. He would often ask for her opinion on small family matters or check if she needed help with something. To him, Emily was like a part of Grace's world, someone gentle and sincere. Emily respected him deeply. She could tell he truly cared for Grace. The engagement party that night was the beginning of what everyone thought would be a perfect love story. The two families took photos, toasted to the future, and spoke of the upcoming wedding. Grace glowed with excitement, and Daniel couldn't stop smiling at her. But no one knew that within a few weeks, everything would fall apart in a way none of them could have imagined. It started on an ordinary afternoon. Daniel had gone on a business trip out of town to meet investors. He was supposed to return the next morning, but late that night, Emily woke to her mother's scream. She rushed to the living room and found her parents standing by the phone, pale and shaking. There had been an accident. Daniel's car had been hit by a truck on the highway. He had been taken to the hospital in critical condition. Grace dropped the phone and ran out of the house barefoot, crying for him. Emily followed behind, terrified. When they reached the hospital, the scene was chaos. Doctors and nurses rushed around, and Grace stood frozen in the hallway, her face wet with tears. The doctors told them that Daniel had suffered a severe head injury and was in a deep coma. His chances of waking up were uncertain. The world seemed to stop. Grace collapsed into Emily's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Their parents tried to comfort her, but the truth was, and no one knew what to do or say. The man who was supposed to become part of their family in a few weeks now lay lifeless in a hospital bed, machines keeping him alive. Days turned into weeks. Grace visited the hospital every day, sitting beside Daniel, holding his hand and talking to him as if he could hear her. Emily went with her sometimes, bringing food or fresh clothes. Watching her sister slowly lose her spark broke Emily's heart. The doctors said Daniel's condition was stable but unchanged. He wasn't getting worse, but he wasn't waking up either. Grace tried to stay strong, but she started missing meals, losing sleep, and snapping at everyone. She refused to attend family gatherings or answer messages from friends. Her life had stopped with Daniel's accident. One afternoon, Emily walked into Grace's room and found her sitting on the floor surrounded by old pictures. Of Daniel smiling, of their engagement, of plans they had made. Grace looked up and said softly, "He promised me we'd get married. He said nothing could stop us. How could this happen?" Emily didn't know what to say. She sat beside her and held her hand. Sometimes silence was the only comfort. Meanwhile, something else was happening behind closed doors that Emily didn't understand at first. Grace's father had been in business talks with Daniel's company for months. They were supposed to merge a portion of their family's construction firm with Daniel's holdings after the wedding. The contracts were drafted but not signed. The merger was meant to secure both families financially and expand their influence. Now that Daniel was in a coma, everything was frozen. His company's board refused to move forward until Daniel's personal affairs were legally settled. Since Daniel had no close living relatives, his assets and company control were temporarily under the supervision of his legal team. Grace's father was desperate. Without the merger, his company could collapse under debt. He started spending sleepless nights in his study, making calls, trying to negotiate. Emily overheard bits of conversations, words like ruin, contract, a deadline. She didn't understand everything, but she could feel the weight of fear in the air. Grace, on the other hand, was lost in her grief. She barely spoke to anyone. She'd spend hours at the hospital whispering to Daniel, begging him to come back. Her health began to decline. One night she fainted in the hospital corridor, and Emily had to rush to get help. As the family tried to hold things together, Daniel's condition remained unchanged. Weeks turned into months. The wedding date passed quietly. The decorations that had once been ordered were canceled, the venue refunded, and the dress tucked away in a closet. It was as if time had stopped. Then came a night that changed everything again. Emily was in the kitchen when her parents called her into the living room. Grace sat there too, pale and trembling, her eyes red from crying. Her father looked exhausted, holding a stack of papers in his hand. He took a deep breath and said, "The lawyers have given us a final notice. If the marriage doesn't happen, the merger will be void. We'll lose everything." Emily frowned, confused. "But how can there be a marriage, Daniel?" "He's not." Her father cut her off. "He's still alive, Emily. The law allows a proxy marriage in certain situations, especially when medical circumstances make it impossible for the person to be present. Daniel's parents agreed to it before they passed away. His legal guardian can authorize it." Emily looked at him in disbelief. "You can't be serious. You can't marry Grace to someone who's unconscious." Her mother spoke softly, her voice shaking. "We don't have a choice, sweetheart. It's just a legal formality. Once Daniel wakes up, they'll already be married and everything will be safe." Grace sat silently, her hands trembling. Finally, she whispered, "I can't do it." Her father's voice broke. "Grace, if we don't, the company will fall apart. We'll lose our home, our savings, everything. You love him. This will protect what he built too." Grace shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "He's not here. He can't even say yes. It's wrong." Emily felt her heart tighten. For a long moment, no one spoke. The room was filled with the sound of Grace's quiet sobs and the ticking of the clock. Then her father turned to Emily. "If Grace can't do it, maybe you could." The room went silent. Emily thought she had misheard. "What?" Her father avoided her eyes. "You're unmarried. The contract doesn't specify which daughter. If you marry him legally, the merger can go through. It would protect both families, and Daniel too. Once he wakes up, we can explain everything." Emily froze. The idea sounded insane. "You want me to marry my sister's fiancé while he's in a coma? That's not right." Her mother placed a hand on her arm. "We know, darling. But think about what's at stake. It's just paperwork. No one needs to know." Grace looked up, her face full of pain. "You can't ask her to do that," she said, her voice shaking. "That's cruel." Her father sighed deeply. "Do you have another way to save this family?" The air felt heavy. Emily didn't know what to say. She looked at Grace, the sister who had always been strong, the one she had admired her whole life, now sitting broken and defeated. She looked at her parents, both aging faster than she had ever seen them, fear etched on their faces. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing her father's words again and again. "It's just paperwork. It'll protect everyone." She thought about Daniel lying motionless in that hospital bed, about the kindness he had shown her before the accident, about the man Grace loved so deeply. Could she really do something like this? Could she marry him even on paper without his consent? But she also thought about her family's future. Their business had been their whole life, built over generations. Losing it would mean losing their home, their employees, everything her parents had worked for. The next morning, she went to the hospital alone. She stood by Daniel's bedside, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. The machines beeped softly in the background. He looked peaceful, as if sleeping. Emily whispered, "If you could hear me, what would you say? Would you forgive me for this?" There was no answer, of course, just the sound of the monitor. But something inside her shifted. She didn't know if it was courage or desperation, but she made a decision. When she got home that evening, her family was waiting in the living room again. Grace looked up with tired eyes. "You don't have to," she said quietly. Emily shook her head. "I'll do it." Her father's eyes filled with tears of relief. Her mother covered her mouth, whispering a prayer. Grace looked at her, confused and hurt. "Why?" she asked softly. Emily smiled sadly. "Because someone has to keep things together until he comes back. I know you can't, so let me do it." Grace said nothing. She just turned her face away, crying quietly. That night, Emily sat alone in her room, staring at the small silver ring Daniel had once given Grace. It felt strange to think that soon she would be called his wife, even if only in name. She didn't know what the future would bring, but deep down she hoped that one day Daniel would wake up. And the truth, no matter how painful and I could be told. Outside, rain began to fall softly against the window. Somewhere in the city, life went on as usual. People laughed, cars passed, lights flickered. But in that one house, everything had changed. Emily didn't know it then. But the decision she made that night would set off a chain of events that no one in her family could have ever predicted. It was the beginning of something that would test love, loyalty, and conscience in ways none of them were ready for. The morning after Emily agreed to the impossible, the house felt different. No one spoke much at breakfast. Her father's eyes looked tired and her mother kept avoiding her gaze. Grace sat quietly, staring at her teacup, her face pale and distant. Emily tried to eat, but every bite felt heavy. She couldn't believe what she had agreed to. The thought of standing in front of someone unconscious and signing marriage papers made her stomach twist. But she reminded herself again and again, it was to protect her family, to keep everything from falling apart. Later that day, her father met with Daniel's lawyers to arrange the legal steps. The process had to be handled carefully. It couldn't look suspicious. The lawyers already knew about the merger, and Daniel's medical guardians had agreed to let the wedding proceed legally, as long as the paperwork followed the right protocol. Emily watched from the corner of the room as the adults discussed details she barely understood. Contracts, shares, board meetings, inheritance rights. It all sounded like another world, far away from the quiet life she was used to. When the meeting ended, her father came over to her. "It's all set," he said softly. "The wedding will take place at the hospital tomorrow evening. It won't be a big ceremony, just the family, a lawyer, and a priest. You just need to sign." Emily nodded, but her throat tightened. She wanted to ask if this was really necessary, but she knew the answer. The weight of the family's future now rested on her. That night, she went to her room and sat by the window. The sky was dark, the city lights flickering in the distance. She thought about Grace and how much her sister had loved Daniel, how happy she had been when he proposed. Now it all felt like another lifetime. Emily closed her eyes and whispered a small prayer, hoping she was doing the right thing. The next day passed in silence. Grace stayed in her room. Their mother busied herself in the kitchen, cooking food no one would eat. Their father left early to finalize the documents. Emily dressed simply in a pale blue dress, the same one she had worn to Grace's engagement party months ago. It wasn't meant for a wedding, but somehow it felt right. When they arrived at the hospital, the hallways were quiet. The air smelled of disinfectant and sadness. Daniel's room was softly lit, machines beeping steadily. He looked peaceful, as if sleeping deeply, unaware of everything happening around him. A priest stood near the bed holding a small Bible. The lawyer placed documents on a side table, checking them carefully. Emily's father motioned for everyone to gather closer. Grace stayed by the door, her hands shaking. She couldn't bring herself to stand near Daniel. The priest looked at Emily gently. "Are you ready, my dear?" Emily nodded, even though her heart was pounding. Her hands felt cold. The ceremony was short. The priest read the vows softly, his voice low and respectful. Emily's words came out trembling, promises she never thought she would say, spoken to a man who couldn't respond. When it came time to sign, her hands shook so much that she had to steady the pen twice. The lawyer slid the papers toward her. "Just here," he said kindly. She wrote her name beside Daniel's, tears forming in her eyes. When the priest said, "You are now husband and wife," the room went completely silent. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Grace turned and walked out quietly. Emily stood there for a moment, looking at Daniel. She whispered, "I hope one day you understand why this happened." After the ceremony, everyone left the hospital in silence. No one celebrated, no one spoke. It was a marriage that felt like a funeral. When they reached home, Emily went straight to her room. She sat on her bed and cried quietly, letting out everything she had held inside. She didn't want to hurt anyone, yet she felt she had betrayed everyone. Daniel, Grace, even herself. The following days passed strangely. Her father seemed relieved, throwing himself into work, talking about how the merger would now go through without issue. Her mother tried to act normal, cooking and cleaning as if nothing had changed. Grace, however, barely spoke. She started avoiding Emily completely. She would leave the room whenever Emily entered, refusing to make eye contact. The bond they once shared, the laughter, the secrets, the late-night talks, it all disappeared. One afternoon, Emily found Grace sitting alone in the garden, staring at the flowers. She hesitated before walking closer. "Grace," she said softly. Grace didn't turn around. "You shouldn't call me that," she said quietly. "Not after what you did." Emily's heart sank. "I didn't want this." "You know that." Grace turned then, her eyes filled with anger and pain. "Then why did you do it?" "You married him." "My fiancé." Tears filled Emily's eyes. "Because someone had to." "Because Dad said." Grace stood up, her voice shaking. "Don't blame them. You could have said no. You always do what they say, Emily. Always the good daughter." Emily didn't argue. She knew Grace was right in her own way. She had said yes when she could have refused. She had chosen duty over everything else. Grace took a step closer. "Do you know what it feels like to lose the man you love twice? Once to an accident and again to your own sister?" Emily couldn't speak. She just stood there, her chest aching. Grace shook her head and walked away, leaving Emily standing in the garden crying silently. From that day on, Grace stopped visiting the hospital. She said she couldn't bear to see him anymore. Emily went instead, sitting by Daniel's side, talking to him about little things, the weather, the flowers, the world outside. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she hoped somehow her voice reached him. Days turned into weeks. Emily's visits became part of her routine. Sometimes she brought books and read aloud. Other times she just sat quietly, watching the soft rise and fall of his chest. She noticed small things, the way his fingers twitched occasionally, the faint color in his face. The doctor said it was a good sign, that his body was responding even if his mind hadn't yet. She started keeping a journal of his progress. Each day she'd write what the nurses said, how he looked, and what she had told him. It gave her something to hold on to, a sense of purpose. One evening, as she sat by his bed, she noticed the sunset through the hospital window. The orange light fell softly on Daniel's face, making him look almost alive. She whispered, "Everyone thinks you can't hear me, but I know you can. Please, just come back soon. Everyone needs you." For a brief moment, she thought she saw his eyelids flutter. Her heart leapt, but it didn't happen again. Still, that tiny movement gave her hope. Meanwhile, at home, things weren't getting better. Grace had started drinking. Her mother pretended not to notice, and her father was too buried in work to care. The house that once felt full of life now echoed with silence and unspoken resentment. One night, Emily heard Grace crying behind her locked door. She wanted to knock, to say something, anything, but she stopped herself. Maybe her presence would only make things worse. Instead, she went back to the hospital the next morning. It was the only place she felt at peace. As weeks passed, the lawyers finalized the merger. Her father was finally smiling again, proud that everything had worked out. He even told Emily, "You saved us. You did what none of us could." But his words didn't comfort her. They only reminded her of the cost. People in their social circle started whispering about the unusual wedding. Some called it strange, others called it scandalous. Rumors spread fast that Emily had married Daniel for his wealth, that Grace had been betrayed, that the family was hiding something. Emily stopped going out. She avoided gatherings, ignored messages, and focused only on Daniel. Then one day a journalist showed up outside the hospital. Someone had leaked the story. "Is it true you married your sister's fiancé while he was in a coma?" the reporter asked, thrusting a microphone toward her. Cameras flashed, people stared. Emily froze, unable to speak. The nurse quickly led her inside, and hospital security pushed the reporters away. But the damage was done. The story spread across social media within hours. When she reached home, Grace was waiting by the door. Her eyes were red from crying. "Are you happy now?" she asked bitterly. "The whole city knows. Everyone's laughing at us." Emily tried to explain, but Grace didn't want to hear it. She stormed off, slamming her door. That night, Emily sat alone in her room, her phone buzzing with messages she didn't open. Headlines flashed online. "Sister marries millionaire in coma." Some comments were cruel, others full of curiosity. People she didn't even know were judging her, calling her names. She turned off her phone and cried until her eyes ached. She hadn't wanted fame or money. All she had wanted was to keep her family together, to protect what Daniel had built. But now it felt like she had only destroyed everything. The next morning, she went to the hospital again. The nurse greeted her kindly, saying, "He's stable today. Maybe he's fighting harder now." Emily smiled weakly and sat by his side. "You see, Daniel," she whispered, "people don't understand. They think I did this for money. But I just wanted to keep your world safe, the world you worked for. I wish you could wake up and tell them yourself." She sat there for hours, watching the steady rhythm of the machines. The world outside could say whatever it wanted. Inside that quiet room, it was just her and him. Two souls connected by an accident neither of them had chosen. As she sat there, she realized something she hadn't before. Over the weeks of caring for Daniel, of talking to him, hoping for his recovery, she had grown attached to him in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something deeper, a strange, quiet bond born out of loneliness and guilt. When she left the hospital that evening, the sky was covered with soft clouds. Rain began to fall, just like the night she had agreed to marry him. She walked slowly, her heart heavy but calm. She didn't know what would happen next, whether he would ever wake up, whether Grace would ever forgive her, or whether the world would stop judging her. But one thing was certain, her life was no longer her own. Everything now depended on the man who lay asleep in that hospital bed. And deep inside, Emily prayed that one day, Daniel would open his eyes and the truth, however painful, would finally be set free. The days after the news broke were some of the hardest for Emily. Everywhere she went, she felt people's eyes on her. Even the neighbors whispered when she passed by. The story of the woman who married her sister's fiancé in a coma had spread like wildfire. At first, she tried to ignore it. She stopped checking her phone, avoided the internet, and stayed away from crowds. But the world seemed determined to remind her of what had happened. Reporters camped outside the hospital and sometimes even near their home, waiting to catch a glimpse of her. Her parents kept telling her to stay calm. "It'll blow over," her father said, though his voice was filled with worry. Her mother avoided looking at her altogether. Grace had moved out temporarily to stay with a friend, unable to face either of them. Emily kept visiting Daniel every day. It was the only place she felt some peace. Inside that quiet hospital room, there were no cameras, no questions, just the sound of the machines and the steady rhythm of his breathing. She would sit beside him, talking softly. Sometimes she told him about her day. Other times she simply held his hand and sat in silence. It became her world, small, quiet, and full of hope that one day he might wake up. One morning, as she entered the hospital, she overheard two nurses talking near the reception desk. "Poor thing," one of them said. "She's so young and people are being cruel." "I know," the other replied. "Still, it's strange, isn't it? Marrying someone in a coma. I just hope he wakes up soon." Emily kept walking, pretending she hadn't heard them. She was used to whispers now. Still, every word cut a little deeper. Inside Daniel's room, she placed fresh flowers by the window. The sunlight streamed in, casting a warm glow on his face. She smiled faintly. "Good morning," she said softly. "The world's noisy today, but don't worry. I'm here." She didn't know why, but she had started talking to him as if he could hear her. Sometimes she even laughed at her own stories, imagining he was listening. It made the loneliness easier to bear. As weeks passed, she began to notice small changes. His fingers moved slightly when she touched them. His eyelids twitched from time to time. The doctors called them reflexes, but to Emily, they were signs of hope. One afternoon, as she was reading to him, the door opened suddenly. Grace walked in. Emily froze. It had been weeks since she'd seen her sister. Grace looked different, thinner, tired, and distant. She didn't say anything at first, just stood by the door staring at Daniel. After a long pause, Grace spoke quietly. "He looks the same." Emily nodded. "Yes, the doctors say his condition is stable." Grace walked closer, her eyes glistening. "Do they think he'll ever wake up?" "They're not sure," Emily said softly. "But I believe he will." Grace looked at her then, really looked, for the first time in weeks. There was no anger in her eyes this time, just sadness. "You still come here every day?" "Yes," Emily said. "Someone has to be here for him." Grace's lips trembled. "It should have been me." Emily reached out gently. "You can still visit him." "He'd want that." But Grace shook her head. "I can't. Every time I see him, I remember what we lost, what I lost." Before Emily could say anything more, Grace turned and walked out. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. Grace's words kept echoing in her mind. She didn't want to take anything from her sister. She just wanted to keep everyone safe. But now even that felt like a mistake. The next morning, the house was quiet. Her father had gone on a business trip related to the merger, and her mother was in the garden. Emily sat by the window staring at the street outside. Life seemed to be moving on for everyone else, while hers was stuck in the same moment, waiting for someone who might never wake up. Then came the phone call that changed everything again. It was from the hospital. The nurse's voice was calm but excited. "Mrs. Hale, there's been a development. You should come right away." Emily's heart raced. She grabbed her bag and rushed out the door. When she reached Daniel's room, 2 doctors and a nurse were inside. One of the doctors turned to her with a small smile. "He's showing signs of consciousness. His brain activity has improved significantly." Emily's knees felt weak. "Do you mean he's waking up?" "Not fully yet," the doctor said gently. "But it's a good sign. He's responding to sound and touch." Tears filled her eyes. She took Daniel's hand and whispered, "You're coming back, aren't you?" For a moment, his fingers moved. A small, almost invisible twitch, but enough to make her heart leap. Over the next few days, Daniel's condition improved steadily. The doctors reduced his medication, allowing his body to respond naturally. Every tiny movement felt like a miracle. Then one quiet morning, as Emily sat reading by his bedside, she heard a faint sound. A soft groan. She looked up immediately. Daniel's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, he looked confused, his gaze wandering around the room. Emily froze, afraid to move or speak. Then his eyes focused on her. He frowned slightly, his lips dry and cracked. "Where am I?" he whispered. Emily's heart raced. "You're in the hospital. You've been here for a while. You had an accident." He blinked slowly, trying to understand. "How long?" "Almost 4 months," she said softly. He tried to speak again, but coughed instead. She quickly poured some water and helped him drink. His hand brushed hers, and she felt a strange rush of emotion. Relief, joy, disbelief all at once. When he was calmer, he looked at her again. "You're Grace?" Emily froze. The question hit her like a wave. She didn't know what to say. The doctors had warned her. They said his memory might be affected, that it was better not to confuse him or cause emotional shock too soon. She swallowed hard and smiled weakly. "You should rest. The doctor said you need time." He nodded slowly and closed his eyes again. Emily sat back, her heart pounding. She didn't want to lie, but she couldn't tell him the truth. Not yet. Over the next few days, Daniel grew stronger. His voice returned, and he began to remember small things. His work, his home, moments before the accident. But his memory of the engagement and the time leading up to it was still blurry. Whenever he looked at Emily, he seemed unsure. Sometimes he called her by Grace's name. Other times he simply said, "You." The doctors were pleased with his progress, and soon he was able to sit up and eat on his own. Emily stayed by his side through it all. One afternoon he looked at her and said quietly, "You've been here every day, haven't you?" She nodded. "Yes," he smiled faintly. "I must have caused you so much trouble." "You didn't," she said softly. "You just needed someone to wait for you." He studied her face for a moment, as if trying to remember something important. Then he said, "You're different somehow, quieter." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She forced a smile. "You've been through a lot, Daniel. Your memory will come back slowly." He nodded, though he looked thoughtful. When her father heard the news that Daniel had woken up, he was overjoyed. "Thank God," he said. "Everything will go back to normal now." But Emily knew nothing would ever be normal again. A week later, Daniel was discharged from the hospital and moved to his home for recovery. Emily went with him. Her father insisted it would be good for her to take care of him personally, since she was now legally his wife. The house was huge and quiet, filled with memories Daniel couldn't recall. The staff welcomed him warmly but kept their distance, unsure how to act around the young woman everyone had read about in the news. Daniel's bedroom overlooked a large garden. Emily helped him settle in, making sure everything was comfortable. He often thanked her, still thinking she was Grace. Each time he said her sister's name, she felt a small sting in her heart. One evening, as she helped him walk around the garden, he said softly, "You know, when I was in the coma, I kept hearing a voice, someone talking to me, reading to me. It made me feel safe." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "Maybe it was just a dream," she said. He smiled faintly. Maybe, but it felt real. She didn't know what to say. All she could think was that somehow part of him did remember her, not as Grace, but as the person who never left his side. Days turned into weeks again. Daniel's health improved quickly. He started walking without help, resumed reading, and even began taking short calls about his company. One afternoon, he asked her to sit with him in the living room. The air was warm and sunlight streamed through the large windows. "There's something I need to ask you," he said slowly. "Everyone treats you differently now. The staff looks at you with respect. They call you Mrs. Hale." Emily's heart pounded. She stayed silent. He looked at her, confused. "Did we get married?" Her throat went dry. She didn't know how to answer. The doctors had told her to wait until he was stronger. But how long could she keep pretending? She forced a small smile. "Yes, but it's a long story." "You should rest first." He frowned slightly. "I don't remember proposing." "Or a wedding." Emily swallowed hard. "It happened when you were unwell." Daniel leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "While I was unconscious?" She didn't reply. The silence between them felt heavy. Finally, he said quietly, "I see." He didn't ask anything else after that, but his expression had changed. There was confusion, and something else too, a faint sadness. That night, Emily sat by her window staring at the moon. She knew the truth would come out soon. Grace would return eventually, and when she did, everything would unravel. But deep inside, she couldn't deny what she felt anymore. Somewhere between guilt and duty, she had grown to care for Daniel deeply, not as a sister-in-law or caretaker, but as the person who had watched over him, prayed for him, and waited through endless days of silence. She didn't know what the future held. All she knew was that the man who had once been her sister's fiancé was now the center of her world, and that one truth could destroy everything if it came to light. And as she sat there, lost in thought, she didn't realize that Daniel, from his room down the hall, was lying awake too, wondering who she really was, and why her presence felt both comforting and heartbreakingly familiar. The first few weeks after Daniel came home were quiet but tense. The house felt larger than ever, the silence heavier. He was recovering well, physically stronger each day, but there was still a fog around his memory. He remembered fragments, small pieces of his life before the accident, but the months leading up to it were blurry. Emily stayed by his side constantly, guiding him, helping him regain his strength, and filling the house with small routines. During the day, she would help him with exercise and simple meals, and at night she would sit by his bed, reading softly or talking about mundane things to make him feel grounded. Each day she learned more about his habits, his preferences, his small quirks that made him who he was. And with every shared smile or quiet moment, Emily felt the bond between them deepen, a bond built on care, patience, and shared silence. It wasn't love yet, not the romantic kind. It was something subtler, something heavier than friendship but lighter than passion. She had grown attached to him in the way one might grow attached to a wounded bird, a careful, tender devotion, where every day was a struggle to help him survive and thrive. Yet beneath that devotion was a growing unease. Every time Daniel looked at her, she saw flashes of confusion in his eyes, moments where he seemed to search for someone else. Grace's name occasionally slipped past his lips, and each time it did, Emily's chest tightened. She had never imagined that keeping him alive would be so complicated emotionally. One evening after dinner, Daniel was sitting in the living room, flipping through old photos of family trips. Emily sat nearby, folding laundry, her mind wandering. "Do you remember any of this?" he asked suddenly, holding up a photograph of himself and Grace laughing on a beach. Emily froze. She hadn't expected him to bring it up so soon. "You look happy," she said carefully. "It was a long time ago." He studied the photo for a moment. "I feel like I should remember more. I know her face. It's familiar. But I can't." His voice trailed off. Emily nodded, saying nothing. She knew the truth would be too much for him right now. Too heavy. He needed time to rebuild slowly without shocks. Days passed, each one similar to the last. Daniel regained his strength physically, taking short walks in the garden, laughing softly at small jokes Emily made, even helping her carry groceries from the car to the house. To the outside world, it looked like a couple settling into domestic life. Yet there was a quiet tension in the air, the weight of a truth neither dared speak aloud. Emily had begun keeping a careful record of his progress, jotting notes about the memories he seemed to recall, the small ways he was returning to his old self. She thought of it as a journal, a map of the journey he couldn't remember. But secretly it was also her way of keeping track of him, of holding on to every fragment of life they shared. One rainy afternoon, Daniel asked Emily to join him in the study. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and old books. He had been sitting at his desk, staring at a blank notebook. "Do you ever wonder about things we can't control?" he asked, his voice low. Emily looked at him, unsure what he meant. "Sometimes." "Why? I mean, accidents, choices, life itself. It feels like so much of what happens is decided for us, and we're just along for the ride." Emily's heart twisted. She understood that better than anyone. "Yes," she said softly. "But sometimes the choices we make can change everything. Even small ones." He looked at her then, his gaze sharp, curious. "What choices?" Emily hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "The ones that affect other people. You do things you don't fully understand, but they matter." Daniel studied her quietly. "Like what?" She shook her head, forcing a smile. "It's not important right now. You should rest." He let it go, but Emily could tell he was thinking about it. His eyes lingered on her longer than usual, searching for something she could not give yet. That night, Emily lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling. She knew the day would come when she could no longer hide the truth. Grace would return. Friends would ask questions. The media, though they had calmed down, would eventually notice the unusual circumstances. And Daniel, now fully awake and recovering, would want answers. Her heart ached at the thought. She had grown to care for him deeply, not in the way she was supposed to, as a sister-in-law or a temporary bride, but in the way one grows to care for a person who has become the center of their life. The next morning, Daniel asked Emily to help him sort through more old photographs. He seemed restless, turning pages slowly, pausing at each image as if it held a secret message. "Who is she?" he asked suddenly, pointing to a photograph of Grace standing next to him at a family gathering. Emily's chest tightened. "That's your sister-in-law," she said carefully. "She was very close to you." Daniel frowned. "I don't remember much, but I feel like I should." "Why does it feel like I'm forgetting something important?" Emily swallowed hard. "Memories can be tricky after an accident. They come back slowly, piece by piece. Don't worry, it's normal." He nodded, but didn't seem fully convinced. "You've been here, helping me?" "Yes," Emily said softly. "Every day. You've been through so much. I wanted to make sure you were okay." He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to decipher her presence, her role. Then he leaned back, closing his eyes, exhausted from the effort. Over the following weeks, Emily noticed something shifting in Daniel's demeanor. He was becoming more reliant on her, asking her advice on small matters: what to eat, which clothes to wear, how to organize his day. There was a quiet dependence, and with it a subtle trust forming between them. But along with the trust came confusion. He often paused when mentioning Grace, struggling to place her in the world he remembered. Sometimes he would call Emily by her sister's name by mistake, and each time it happened, Emily felt a sharp pang in her chest. One afternoon, Emily was in the kitchen preparing lunch when Daniel walked in, holding a small notepad. "I've been thinking," he said quietly. "I don't remember much, but I feel something. Something about the person who stayed with me while I couldn't speak. Someone who cared, who didn't leave. Emily's hands froze on the cutting board. She looked up at him, unsure what to say. You, he continued, looking directly at her. I don't know your name properly in my mind yet, but you were there. You helped me, He trailed off, searching for words. Emily felt tears prick her eyes. She wanted to say something reassuring, but she couldn't tell him the truth yet. I'm glad I could help, she said softly. That's all that matters. He nodded slowly, still studying her. I feel like I should know you, more than I do. But I don't. Do you understand? Yes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I understand. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's recovery continued. He began attending small business meetings with Emily by his side, regaining his confidence. She guided him through every step, explaining financial decisions, contracts, and company affairs. He was grateful, but he often looked at her with an expression that was impossible to read. Gratitude, suspicion, curiosity, and something softer, something unspoken. Meanwhile, Grace remained absent. Her brief visit months ago had left the house tense, and Emily suspected she would return eventually. The thought of her sister discovering everything terrified her. Grace's anger would be immense, and Emily knew she could not defend the choices she had made without hurting both of them. Emily spent many nights awake, thinking about the future. How would she explain what had happened while Daniel was unconscious? How would he react when he realized he had legally married her? How could she protect him, her sister, and herself all at the same time? One evening, as Daniel rested in the study after reviewing company documents, Emily sat nearby, organizing files. He looked at her quietly and asked, Do you ever feel trapped by choices you didn't make? Emily paused, looking up. All the time, she said honestly. But sometimes the only thing you can do is stay and do your best, even if it's hard. He nodded slowly, as if considering her words. I think I understand. But some choices, they're complicated. Even if we do the right thing, it doesn't mean it's easy. Emily smiled faintly. No, it never is. That night she sat by the window again, staring out at the dark streets. She had grown used to the quiet, the tension, the emotional tightrope she walked every day. But the thought of Grace returning, and the inevitable reckoning, kept her awake. Somewhere deep inside, Emily realized she had begun to love Daniel. Not as a duty, not as a sister-in-law, but as the person she had cared for when he had needed her most, and she knew that love would complicate everything. Yet even with that knowledge, she couldn't stop herself. Every smile he gave her, every small glance of gratitude, every quiet moment together strengthened the bond she had formed, a bond that might change everything once the truth came out. And in the quiet of the night, Emily whispered to herself, No matter what happens, I'll protect him. I'll stay. I won't leave. Unbeknownst to her, Daniel was lying awake in the next room thinking about the same thing. The woman who had cared for him, who had never left, who had been his anchor. She was no longer just a presence in his life. She had become a part of it, whether he understood it yet or not. And neither of them knew that soon. Everything would change, a confrontation, a revelation, and a test of love, loyalty, and forgiveness that neither could have prepared for. It had been months since Daniel had fully returned home from the hospital. His health had recovered remarkably, though some gaps remained in his memory. The accident had left shadows, small holes in the continuity of his life. Emily had remained by his side every step of the way, guiding him through the world that had moved on without him. She had grown into a quiet companion, someone who understood his needs even before he voiced them. And somewhere deep inside, she had also grown to care for him in ways that scared her. Despite the calm and routine of their lives, Emily always knew that this fragile peace would not last. Grace had been away, but she would return eventually. And when she did, the truth, the real story of the hospital wedding, the family pressure, and Emily's role, would surface. Emily dreaded the moment, knowing there was no way to escape the confrontation. It arrived sooner than she expected. It was a late afternoon when the doorbell rang. Emily, alone in the living room, hurried to answer it. Standing at the door was Grace. Her face was pale but determined. Her eyes, once filled with confusion and sadness, now burned with anger. Emily, Grace said, her voice tight, we need to talk. Emily stepped aside, letting her sister in. The house felt heavier, the air thick with tension. Grace walked past the living room and into the study, where Daniel was quietly reading documents. "Daniel," Grace said sharply. He looked up, startled by her voice. His eyes softened when he saw her, and he smiled faintly. "Grace, you're here." Grace's gaze shifted toward Emily, narrowing. "I came to see him." "To see why? Why this happened?" Emily took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Grace, please. We can talk, but let's do it quietly." Grace shook her head. "No, I need answers now. You married him, my fiancé, while he was in a coma. How could you do that?" Daniel's expression changed. Confusion, concern, and a hint of suspicion flashed across his face. "Wait, married? Emily, what is she talking about?" Emily stepped forward slowly. "Daniel, I need to explain, but you have to listen carefully. What happened? It wasn't simple. You were in a coma. The family. They asked me to do this to protect everyone. You, the company, and even Grace." Daniel frowned, trying to make sense of her words. Why would anyone ask you to marry me like that? And why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want to shock you," Emily said softly. "The doctors said you needed time to recover, and telling you immediately would have been too much. I only wanted to take care of you." Grace's eyes filled with tears, a mix of hurt and rage. "Take care of him? You stole him from me? You pretended to be me. You... Her voice broke. Emily tried to reach out, but Grace stepped back. "I didn't want to. I never wanted to do this. I only did it because Dad and Mom, they insisted. They said it was the only way to save the company. And I thought it was temporary. I never wanted to hurt you." Daniel leaned back in his chair, processing the weight of the words. I don't understand." "Married legally, how?" Emily swallowed hard. "The lawyers prepared the documents. You were unconscious. I signed them. It was to protect your life and the company. I never wanted this to happen. I never expected to feel the way I do now." Daniel's gaze softened, and he looked at Emily for a long time. There was confusion, yes, but there was also a quiet gratitude. The woman who had stayed by his side, nursed him back to health, guided him through recovery. She was a part of his life now, whether he fully remembered it or not. Grace's hands trembled. "You didn't even think about me. About what I wanted. How could you take him from me?" Emily's voice cracked. "I didn't take him from you. You left him at the hospital, overwhelmed by grief. I stayed because he needed someone. I stayed because no one else could." Daniel's eyes moved between the two sisters. "Grace, Emily, what's happening?" Emily stepped closer, gently. "Daniel, I never meant to deceive you. I only wanted to protect you, and I've grown to care for you, not because I had to, but because I wanted to." Daniel looked down, running a hand through his hair. The air was tense, thick with emotions both unspoken and overwhelming. I don't know what to say," he admitted. Grace sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. Emily sat nearby, unsure what to do next. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Finally, Daniel stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden. He was quiet for a long time, thinking, processing. Emily's heart pounded. She didn't know what he would decide, what this revelation would mean for all of them. He turned slowly to face them. "Emily, you stayed with me when no one else did. You cared for me, guided me, helped me recover. I remember. Parts of it, even if I didn't fully understand at the time." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, I did it because I cared, not because anyone forced me." Daniel walked closer to her, his voice low. "And Grace, you loved me too. I can see that. I know I don't remember everything, but I know what I feel when I look at you." Grace lifted her head, tears streaming. "Then why did this happen?" Daniel hesitated. "Because life sometimes forces impossible choices, and sometimes people make mistakes trying to protect the ones they love. But I can see both of you care for me, and that's important." Emily and Grace exchanged glances, both realizing that Daniel's words carried forgiveness, not judgment. Over the next few days, the tension in the house began to shift. Conversations were careful but honest. Emily explained everything in detail: the family pressure, the legal marriage, the reasons behind her decisions. Grace listened quietly, angry and hurt, but slowly understanding the impossible situation her sister had faced. Daniel processed the truth at his own pace. At times he asked questions, sometimes repeating them, trying to understand. He was frustrated, confused, but he didn't lash out. Instead, he observed the care, the honesty, and the devotion he had received from Emily. Gradually, Grace began to forgive. She admitted her anger had been fueled by fear of losing the man she loved, fear of betrayal, and fear that her family would fall apart. Emily listened without judgment, acknowledging the hurt she had caused without apology for actions she had no choice over. One evening, the three of them sat together in the garden. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Daniel turned to Emily and Grace. "You two," he said slowly. "You both care for me in ways I didn't deserve, ways I can barely understand. I'm grateful. I'm lucky to have both of you in my life." Grace nodded, wiping tears from her cheeks. "We just wanted what was best, and sometimes the path to that isn't simple." Emily reached out and held Daniel's hand. "I've always wanted to protect you, and I still do. But I've also realized I care for you in a way that goes beyond duty. I didn't plan it, but it's real." Daniel looked at her, really looked, as if seeing her for the first time. The warmth in her eyes, the sincerity in her voice, and he could feel it. And somewhere deep inside he realized that he had grown attached to her too.